getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPEX, BREC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for staying for a session called The Future of Transit and Mobility, sponsored by our friends at Jacobs. We're delighted you stayed with us after the governor's address, and we hope you'll find this session to be interesting. We're all going to sit here. There are no PowerPoints. We're going to keep it informal. We're going to have a Q&A as we kind of talk about this. We have some very interesting guests who have come from out of town to be with us, and I'll introduce them shortly. My name is John Spain. I'm the Executive Vice President for the Baton Rouge Area Foundation. I'm also pleased to be a member of the CPEX Board of Directors. This panel, and by the way, we will leave some time at the end for your questions, and there'll be a microphone in the audience to do that. So think about what you want to ask this panel. As we talk about the subject matter, as congestion worsens in metropolitan areas across the globe, environmental concerns continue to grow, and more people are geographically isolated from centers of opportunity. How is transit changing to address those challenges? What stands in the way of making high-functioning transit available to those who need it the most? And what are the opportunities for shifting from the transit we now have to the transit we need? And the panelists will talk about that. Our first speaker today is John Robert Smith, the Transportation for America Senior Policy Advisor for Smart Growth America. He's also the former mayor of Meridian, Mississippi. He administers technical assistance programs for Smart Growth America covering downtown revitalization, economic and physical health. He is often a keynote speaker on walkability, transit-oriented development, and national trends impacting local communities. He served for 16 years as the mayor of Meridian, Mississippi. He rebuilt Meridian's downtown, and it is a showplace today for how you do that. I also know from my personal relationship and friendship with John Robert Smith, because we share a common love for passenger rail service in this country, and he was privileged to serve as the president of Amtrak for a number of years. On my far right, Calvin Gladney, president and CEO of Smart Growth America, who was a little bit late because he was told that his flight's been changed and he may have to spend the night in Baton Rouge and have dinner with us. And that's not all bad. He is a nationally recognized thought leader on the equitable and sustainable revitalization of communities. Prior to going to Smart Growth America, he was managing partner of Mosaic Urban and has worked in over 25 cities. He was also the Urban Land Institute's Senior Visiting Fellow for Equity and served as Vice President of the Anacostia Waterfront Corporation and the General Counsel of Bridge Housing Corporation. Our final panelist is familiar to all of us. We're honored to have the Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, Dr. Shawn Wilson. He was appointed Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation by Governor John Bel Edwards on January the 11th of 2016 after serving more than 10 years in executive service at the department. Since his appointment, Dr. Wilson has been a tireless advocate for new revenue, maximizing federal dollars available to Louisiana, advancing a balanced and comprehensive transportation policy for the state, and ensuring that the department is more collaborative in its work at every level. A great example of that this morning was a ribbon cutting where we opened and dedicated the right-of-way for Dejan Boulevard in the Health District, which was a unique partnership of federal, state, and local people coming together to build what is going to be one of the best new streets connecting Essen Lane and Bluebonnet. And it wouldn't have happened had we not had that spirit of collaboration where everybody came together in a time where there are very few resources to make something exciting happen. We're going to talk more about that, but let's listen to John Robert, and he's going to start by looking at a national level from where he sits and where he works each day. Welcome.
Thank you, John. And it's good to be back in Baton Rouge again. I also appreciate very much the long relationship we at Smart Growth America have had with CPEX and the fine work that they do. And I've been pleased to be a part of some of that here in the Baton Rouge area. Being the last panel of the day, I thought it would be appropriate to reflect on what we have heard over the course of the day. We began the day with a conversation about resilience, and then we moved to planning, best practices, ethical and equity issues, and then to demand. And underpinning all of those is how we move our people about, how we connect them to jobs, to education, to health care, to the daily needs of life, how we get them out of harm's way. And wherever you go in the country, those people I'm referring to are anchored by two giant generations, one being the baby boom generation. Until recently, we have been the largest generation ever in the history of the country, with the longest life expectancy of any generation in the history of the country. So we will be with you for a while. And our choices are going to have impact and matter. But we have been eclipsed recently by the millennial generation. Now they are the largest generation of the history of the country and occupy the largest portion of the workforce. And while you may think these generations are poles apart, and certainly they are in age, they're really making very similar choices about where they're choosing to live and how they're choosing to spend the hours of each day. And from those two basic choices flow many of the other decisions that they make and this nation makes. Let's think about housing. Boomers are downsizing. We don't want to dust all that stuff in a big house anymore. We don't want to spend the few hours we have left mowing the grass. Millennials are not buying houses at all. They're renting. When it comes to transportation, we boomers don't want to fight traffic and be stuck in it for those few hours, and it makes us crotchety. The millennials don't buy automobiles like we did. Why, 28% of them don't even have a driver's license. Can you imagine that? And when it comes to how we travel across the country, boomers want to stay connected to the learning opportunities of life, see this great nation and visit our families, and you don't want us on the interstate highway system for the next 20 years. Millennials have grown up taking other forms of transportation. They're very multimodal. And you see, both generations are actually choosing to buy less stuff. They're buying experiences. We're buying time. The three grandfathers on the stage are buying time with those grandchildren. The millennials are buying these great experiences that enrich their lives. And the job creators are paying attention to this, especially to the millennials. At Smart Growth America, we did a report in 2015 called Core Values, where 500 large corporations, home headquarters, tech companies had moved into downtowns in a 5-year period. You saw the announcement by Amazon. They have chosen New York and a suburb of Washington, D.C. And what we found in 2015 from our research and what Amazon told you in the news release today, it's all about finding the new, bright, young workforce of the future. And transportation, public transportation access was a key to their choice and a key to all 500 of the choices I referenced earlier. And that includes small places like Conway, Arkansas, not just the biggest places. So those transportation investments, if you don't know this, learn this if nothing else. The public transportation investments of any kind, anywhere in the world, aviation, highways, passenger rail, transit, none of them pay for themselves. So dispel the notion that the private sector is going to come in and build all of this infrastructure for us if we'll just get out of the way. That's not the way this works. There has to be a public dollar investment. There is no private sector savior that will save you from that. And those are hard choices to be made of the public sector investment to leverage private sector dollars. And that public sector investment is certainly local government level investment. As I know from 20 years in service, it's state dollars are invested, but you got to have a federal partner in this process. And let's take a look at where we stand at the federal level from our federal partner. You know, the president's budget has started each year. It zeroes out passenger rail, zeroes out transit, and actually significantly cuts highway funding. The good news is Congress has decided that domestic spending should grow, and in 2019 it'll be up to almost $600 billion in domestic spending. When you look at appropriations, you can see where they're spending that money. Highways will grow to about $50 billion in FY19. Transit will grow to a little over $13.5 billion. The Build or Tiger program that accomplished so many of the imaginative projects in transportation grew from $500 million in 17 to $1.5 billion in 18, now to probably $750 to $1 billion in FY19. Passenger rail, just for the national system that serves Mississippi and Louisiana, has grown to $1.3 billion. And when I was chairman of the board, when I was first on the board of Amtrak, the whole system, including the Northeast Corridor, was only $500 million. So we've grown that much. This $1.3 billion is just for the national system. And then we've created funds that will allow you to build new passenger rail and actually operate it for the first 3 years. And I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars for the building of new passenger rail and to sustain the operation of that. Now, of course, in Washington there's always bad news, and the bad news is that FTA, Federal Transit Administration, is sitting on $1.8 billion of transit funding. This is already authorized, already appropriated, and already awarded to communities, and FTA is not signing the checks and sending them out to those communities. And that's something we're fighting on the Hill right now. But let's look at FY20. In FY20, the tax cuts that I guess we've been enjoying have reduced the revenue to the federal government by $200 billion. That'll be a $200 billion hole starting FY20. The sequesters, remember them, kick in FY20, and they will further reduce the federal revenue available by $126 billion. And then the trust fund goes bankrupt again, which is $21 billion. And the trust fund funds highways and transit, $21 billion a year. So that's about a $400 billion hole over what we have now just to begin with in FY20, absent your voice and what we do to make a difference there. I tell you all of this so that you understand there is a window and an opportunity for your transportation vision that you have. But that window is closing, and it's closing rapidly. Remember the story that was shared with you about Seattle, where they were offered $1 billion for transit and turned it down, and now they're taxing themselves $400 billion for the same investment? Well, and it's not this government, but a previous government here was offered significant transportation dollars, and you turned them down. There are still opportunities for those transportation dollars, but they're fleeting. You don't have time to debate much longer. Now's the time to act.
Thank you, John Robert. Calvin.
Is my microphone on? I guess it is, because I feel like I learned so many things just now. First of all, the use of the word crotchety as a technical term within a transportation and mobility discussion.
You will learn the definition of that word later in life, Calvin.
Said very well from a crotchety old man.
He keeps me honest. I was also trying to picture John Roberts dusting. You mentioned dusting earlier. So, Well, he gave a good kind of big picture backdrop, sense of where things are going in terms of mobility. One of the things that I thought about is, well, what part of the conversation is missing? And I think a lot of what we talk about in terms of mobility really relates to what kind of transportation and transit investments we can do to create and catalyze economic development. And I wanted to maybe add to that discussion to say that we need to go beyond economic development and talk about equity. Now, how many people here have seen a visual like this? I just like to use the one with bikes because it's transportation and mobility. But one way you can unpack this visual is just to simply say, equity is about outcomes. That the final result is good for everyone. So equality, the process is the same, or the resources that are divvied up are the same for everyone. Equity is a fight, a push, a set of investment decisions that make sure that the outcomes are similar, if not the same, for everyone. Just a sort of simplified way of looking at it. And I wanted to unpack equity in a couple of ways, particularly when it comes to mobility. So I'm just going to have a couple of easy visuals to have a discussion, because I like visuals. So first I wanted to talk about health and how the type of transportation investments and mobility investments have an equitability issue tied to health and health outcomes. So one of our programs is called Complete Streets, and we were working on a project in Louisville, Kentucky. It was an urban corridor, Dixie Highway. Anybody here from Louisville? They actually call it the Death Highway, I believe, unfortunately. And one of the reasons why is there are tons of fatalities, pedestrian fatalities, from people being hit by cars. But one of the things we saw in working on the corridor is when you unpack the data, more people of color were being hit by cars and dying, disproportionate to the number of people of color in that particular corridor. And that was because a lot of the social services and the jobs that they could get to, they had to use that corridor and cross that corridor in order to get to them. So one kind of equity decision where you'd make a different decision in terms of your transportation or transit investments is to say, maybe it's not about the efficiency and speed of the transportation, because maybe we need things like bulb outs where you have these traffic calming measures. Maybe we need more pedestrian crosswalks where you don't naturally say, well, I'm going to run across the street here because the next crosswalk is half a mile down. Maybe we need to make some different transportation investments because it ends up affecting the health of residents in the area and disproportionately and unfortunately negatively affecting oftentimes people of color in those areas. Another version of this on health is I read a study that said people's blood pressure is higher when they live next to or on an urban corridor. So when we make our transportation investments and say, let's make this street so we can move people as fast as possible to and fro, the people in that neighborhood, and we all know where the highways and the fast roads, where those roads are placed, what neighborhoods those are placed in, who are the people that tend to live near those roads. So we have to say to ourselves, if we want to be equitable when it comes to transportation investments, and we know that there's these disparate impacts when it comes to health, maybe we'd make different decisions. Equity is the future of mobility, and that's tied to health. So that's one. Wealth building. Oftentimes we talk about transportation investments and we talk about economic development. We say, well, it's about access to jobs. If we can get people to jobs, then everything will be okay. Has anybody read the book Evicted or know Matthew Dowd? It's an awesome book. He also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times just recently, and he talked about the myth of jobs with the idea that it's not just that you have a job, it is the quality of the job that you have. And frankly, whether that job is a tool for wealth building or is a tool just for the status quo and just getting by. I have an older brother in New York, and he was talking about this particular job he had, and he said, you know, all this does is buy me car fare. In other words, all that the job does is basically pay his basic expenses and the ability for him to pay to get back and forth to that job. So we have to think to ourselves, do we make transportation investments that get people just to the jobs that make them barely, and maybe in many cases not even, make ends meet? Or we try to figure out, are there transportation investments, mobility investments, that allow people to become more entrepreneurial and entrepreneurs as a means to wealth building, and maybe get to more quality jobs? And that's where passenger rail and some of the things that are talked about between New Orleans and Baton Rouge can bridge that gap and say, well, let's make sure that people can get to not just a retail job that just makes them make ends meet, but maybe they can get to a job that leads to a career. Equity is the future of mobility, and we'd make different decisions if we were thinking about things equitably. And finally, resilience. And this picture reminds me of that saying that says, fall down 7 times and stand up 8. With the idea that in some ways you can think about resilience and say to yourself, resilience is about being able to play better offense instead of just defense. And so when you think about transportation investments, I often like to say to folks, being poor is expensive. Being poor is expensive. So let's give an example. So you work a retail job, and so the transportation engineers, and no offense to transportation engineers, some of my best friends are transportation engineers. They say to themselves, well, hey, let's make sure the headways, we can make sure that there's a fluidity to this transportation, that we can pick the stops so that people can get as fast as possible to and fro, and make sure we have a great level of service during rush hour. Now, if you work a retail job, do you travel during rush hour? So that means when you get off your retail job at 10 o'clock and you're working class or lower income or lower wealth, and now you have a transportation system that's built for you, but it's not for you. Because the system is actually it's at its lowest peak and its lowest service when you actually need it the most. And so how do you deal with when things pop up and something happens and there's an emergency, and now you're trying to get home from work, but the next train comes in an hour? You're not able to be resilient. Oh, but let's have another example. Well, let's say you lose your job and people say, oh, well, there's access to jobs. You have a 1-hour trip, it's fine, or 1.5-hour drive. You lose your job. All the jobs are in a certain place. Are you going to drive an hour and a half and ride an hour and a half each time to do interviews? You don't have the car fare. You don't have the money to spend. You might not have the time for childcare. So when you think about resilience and you think about transportation investments, you have to say, we want to make sure we change the outcomes. And so we have to think specifically and say, are there particular communities, whether they're lower income, communities of color, are there communities where we have to make a different set of transportation and transit and mobility infrastructure decisions that make sure they'll be resilient based on where they sit, not where everyone sits? And so the future of transportation, the future of these mobility investments really has to take into account equity, because in the cities, which used to be called the inner cities as a way to disparage them, where now everybody wants to be, based on what John Roberts says, this convergence of boomers and millennials and Generation Y and Generation Z and actually Generation Alpha, just in case you wanted to know what the next generation is being called. They're all looking to come back to the city. And so the question is going to be, what do we do when all those folks are trying to come back to the city and the lower income folks who are there now may have to move to the suburbs and have even less transit and transportation options? So if we want to focus to go beyond economic development, beyond equality, and get to the point of equity, we have to say to ourselves, are we going to make some different decisions? And just wanted to give you 2 quick examples of what we've done at Smart Growth America. One example is, what do you measure? So oftentimes our transportation and mobility investments and infrastructure are based on decisions that don't measure any of these questions of equity. So they don't say, well, what would happen if we make the right transportation investment that creates an efficiency in the system, but actually has disproportionately negative effects to low-income people? It's not measured. It's not part of the criteria in making the decisions between the transportation projects. And so what we did is we created a project called Performance Measures, where we said we're going to bake in more of these equity-related criteria, both in terms of how you select between projects, but also how you evaluate and measure the project on the back end. And so if you're not measuring it, then you're not showing that you care about it. And if you're not evaluating it up front and choosing the projects, then you can't really say you're about changing the outcomes. So that's just one example. And the second and final example would be who is at the table. At the end of the day, sometimes it's not just the message, it is the messenger, and it is the decision maker. So you have to ask yourself, if you're trying to think about equity and not just equality of process, but actually equality and therefore equity of the outcomes, at some point, those people of color, those retail workers, those small business owners who live who actually are in your neighborhood longer than the residents because they're there 18 hours a day and then they're trying to go back home, are they at the decision-making table? Are they a part of the community engagement process when we make these transportation decisions? So all of these things make us say to ourselves, if we're really going to be beyond economic development, beyond equality, and really get to equity, are we measuring the things and those criteria which actually get us to equity? And actually, do we have folks at the table, not just in terms of the engagement process, but as inputs and decision makers? And so the future of mobility and transportation is equity, not just these convergences. Because ultimately, if we don't get to equity, then we really don't get to anything that's fair at all, in my opinion. Thanks.
Secretary Wilson.
So I get the privilege of not sitting in this seat because I didn't want to sit next to John because that's a very expensive endeavor if you know John. And so I get nestled between these two really talented and bright folks. And I have to tell you, there's not a lot that either of them said I can disagree with, because I think it's the right placement of priority on what matters. And so when you think about what matters, you know, for me as secretary, not many people in this life have been blessed to sit in the seat that I get to sit in. And it's very different, it's very dynamic. But for me, it became very real on June 5th of this year because Layla Rose was born. That was my first, or is my first granddaughter. And she is the person who is going to inherit the place that the governor spoke about, inherit the environment that John spoke about. And I think about my son Joshua, who's 16, who has yet to ask for a driver's license. It makes me feel really good because my insurance stays really low. But it drives my wife crazy because we now have to shuttle him around. And guess what? Uber won't allow me to get a seat for him or a ride for him if he's underage if I'm not accompanying him. Just a tidbit for those who might want to take Uber or Lyft or use some security measure for their kids. I think that's a developable opportunity. And when I think about my son who still lives at home and my granddaughter who's less than a mile away, I think about what's going to be the world that they live in terms of having equity of opportunity and access to that. And then I get quickly brought back to reality of what I do when I go into the office at 1201 Capitol Access Road on the 3rd floor and serve as the Secretary of Transportation, because I'm faced with a challenge of where we've been and dealing with generational neglect, generational decision-making that has not benefited us very well, I think, as a state. And so when I became secretary, I told the governor there are 4 things I want to do as secretary. One is make a case for new revenue in everything I do. The second thing is take full advantage of every federal dollar that we have, because over 50% of my budget is tied to federal funding. The third thing I want to do is have a balanced transportation agenda, which gets to what these gentlemen talked about in terms of having a balanced transportation policy for the state. And the fourth thing really speaks to your last slide of who's at the table. And so as a department, my fourth option and fourth PowerPoint was to be more collaborative in making those decisions, which means open the door of conversation. Some of those will be yes conversations, some of them will be no conversations, but the process, the engagement, the give and take makes more sense for us at the end. So those are the 4 PowerPoints that I try to invoke as secretary as long as I'm secretary. Those are going to be staples of what I do. The reality is we're living off of $1989, trying to create a 2030 transportation system. We're dealing with an interstate system, and our deputy secretary, and some of our best employees are engineers, by the way. So our deputy secretary, I don't know if he's here or not, is Eric Calavota, and he and I were talking today about challenges in a new transportation bill that even when you think about the interstate system as it was created 50 years ago, it was hugely invested by the federal government. And we as a state are handicapped in a sense in that I cannot sustain or maintain that with my revenue source. And so what I should be doing with my revenue, such as investing in other modes of transportation, whether it's rail, whether it's BRT, whether it's putting in bike share programs, building complete streets with the bicycle paths and health walks and things of that nature that's going to be on the Dijon project, I can't spend the little dollars I have doing those really important things at the local level in the state of Louisiana because I have to invest in the interstate system. Because if I get the 50% of my funds, I have to meet their performance standards. And so we're struggling with that as a state because I think the policy of figuring out which are those cities that the next generation will want to be in. I mean, what would have happened if Amazon said we're coming to Louisiana, anywhere in Louisiana? Because if you look at their RFP, they were looking for how do you move people quickly, effectively, safely? How do you provide a place for them to live, play, and entertain and educate their young? What would have happened if they'd have come here? We would not have been able to deal with it. We would not have been able to catch up enough to produce something in a timely fashion that would have taken advantage of the billions of dollars they're going to invest in the next 10 years where they land it. So for me as a transportation professional in the state of Louisiana, my argument and position is how do we deliver those things in a way that's sustainable, that fits within the political landscape of a 4-year window, that fits within the political landscape of my Republican conservative friends on one side versus my Democratic, more progressive friends on the other side. Because in spite of all of those young people that are going to come here, everything that they own, buy, sell, or trade is going to come on a transportation system. So I agree that you can't do away with the interstate system. I agree that you have to have those bicycle paths and those safer roads. I agree that there's disparity in who's wearing seatbelts and who's getting hit as pedestrians. I agree that there's not access equally for folks to go to school and get jobs and get good health care. So it's a pretty significant balancing act and juggling act. So our challenge in Louisiana, if there's nothing you take away from this, is I cannot suggest to you that it's in our best interest to invest in rail with all of our resources. Because if I don't do what I'm doing now, what's going to happen to our system? What's going to happen to the 12,000 bridges that we have? What's going to happen to the highways that might be crumbling today? And so when I complete or build that next complete street, I'm actually taking away in my budget an opportunity to do an overlay for something that's absolutely critical because it's still farm to market. It's still quality of life. It's still that congestion factor that John Robert talked about. If I can go and say I'm going to build a new bridge, that new bridge is going to cost me $1 billion. Think how much investment I can make in a rail system to perhaps move folks between now and then, between those jobs in the river region and the places where they're going to live, whether that's Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Livingston, wherever they're going to live. Think about what that's going to be. The real implementation challenge is, can I do that in the next 5 years? Not on this budget. Can I do it in a way that captures the critical time-sensitive nature of opportunity and job investment, that congestion is not going to be discouraging? What happens in West Baton Rouge? What happens on I-10 in Lake Charles for folks who live in Westlake that need to get to the jobs on the Calcasieu River? Those are challenges that we face here at the Department of Transportation. And if nothing else other than knowing we need revenue, understand, I think this administration has opened the door to policy alternatives that we have not necessarily had before. And that takes a long time to change the culture and the mindset, because what the administration says is one thing, but what comes out the legislature is something totally different, because they're the ones that are going to say you can't have a rail investment program. They're the ones that said you can't right-size your gas tax revenue, your user fee, to the 17 cents that would have brought it just up to what inflation has eroded is what it would have cost. And they did not vote on it. They said, let's not vote on that because that's not important. And now we're facing a situation that maybe, we won't have the dollars in next year's budget to match that 51+% of federal dollars that we get today for maintaining our system. We're committed to doing that, but we're going to need a legislature to allow us to do that. We're going to need communities that are going to say, I just don't want to build 4 big brand new lanes and think about how will I move people, because you can put 1,000 people in cars, you can put 1,000 people on buses, you can put 1,000 people on bikes, you can put 1,000 people walking at a train or standing at a train station. It's all a different impact, but it's still moving those thousands of people, and each one of those modes are going to cost something different. And we have to think a little more strategically about how we fund and invest those things and drive those policies.
Okay, Mr. Secretary. Everybody in this room probably could tell us a story about how frustrated and angry they've been recently in traffic in Baton Rouge. If you go anywhere, someone's going to talk about, we need another bridge.
Bill Withers said there ain't no sunshine when she's gone, so.
The problem is,
Jimmy Davis says, please don't take my sunshine away.
and the problem is our young and brightest people are leaving the state, and in many cases going to a different lifestyle that John Robert discussed. And we're talking about building bridges. We talked about a northern bypass that would utilize an existing bridge, but our local politicians said they weren't interested in doing that, and that would have been a toll road. Hardly a new idea anymore. We had the legislative session where we talked about a 17-cent gas tax that would have given you money not to do even great, exciting things, but just to have enough money to match the federal dollars that would be available. John Roberts says the federal money is also going to be constrained in the near future. John Robert also says that young people are not buying cars, and so one would ask at some point, when do we start thinking differently that maybe we don't need a bridge because we're not going to have so many cars? Maybe we're going to look at other modes of transportation for those people that aren't investing in cars. And we know that technology is going to present us with yet new opportunities, high-speed trains and others, that we're not close to being able to fund. And when we had the money given to us by the feds for a high-speed train, we didn't take it. So the answer here is we all would like to do something better and different, and we kind of even know what that is. But we don't have the money. And where does that leave us?
In a quagmire. And I say that, but if you think about the places that have really done a good job with moving mass numbers of people, it didn't happen very quickly. And so I'm not saying let's be very slow and methodical and not be aggressive with it. The reality is, as we toured the Bright Line or we were on the West Coast, most of these communities have had very robust systems of investing and moving people in mass. And if you think about Louisiana, when I got to the department, less than $5 million a year was being spent on transit from the state's perspective. No real, everything that you were spending on transit came from the fare box or local state government or local government budgets. Not much of that has changed. And so from a policy standpoint, when we had that opportunity, and you were a part of the effort to try and help do it post-Katrina, we said, let's figure out how to move mass numbers of people back and forward to New Orleans, and we created the LA Swift effort. It was a free bus service, and it was great because we were building a ridership. We were building an imperative to say, let's do this better, faster, more efficiently, more affordably. Let's put internet service on it. And then we ended up going to $5 and $10, and then the money dried up. And the hardest part of that argument was we had a few vocal advocates. John was one of them. CPEX and Boo was one of them. And the department was there saying, guys, ladies, this is important for us to invest in. How do we do it? And we stretched as far as we could until we couldn't stretch anymore. And every time we get an opportunity to respond, whether it's adding a new ferry service to Plaquemine because the bridge is closed, very small, very expensive, really bad decision, but it was something you had to do, we did it. And so I think your agency, your Department of Transportation is willing to go there. The challenge is where's the choir? Where are the folks who are going to charge the hill behind us to say enough is enough, let's make the investment and go do it?
All right, so our other two panelists flew in here on mass transit to be with us today. And they
might not get out today.
That's exactly right. You all have the advantage of having a national perspective. You work in cities across the country. When you come and sit with us in Louisiana, are you perplexed? What are your thoughts? What do you see happening in other states? Or are we all in this together and it's a national crisis? John Robert, what would you say, listening to the Secretary of Transportation, about where we find ourselves in Louisiana? And we know there are places in the country that are doing better, some are doing worse, but many have many more robust choices for transportation that do deal with the equity issue. What are you seeing?
Well, in my work over the past 9 years since being at Smart Growth America, I've been now in 113 different cities and towns working across the country in 9 years. A lot of travel involved in that, but you get to see these cities and towns, the very largest in the country down to the very, very smallest, in red states and blue states, in rural areas, metropolitan areas. So you get a fair assessment of what's going on in the country. Things have changed, and of course, and that's in economic development, that's in how we move, that's about the generations I discussed, and there are places that have had robust transportation systems, but it didn't bubble up out of the ground. I mean, they made conscious choices in the built environment and how they spend their public dollars and how the public allows those dollars to be spent. They've been making those choices for generations in some cases. Others are coming to it new, but they realize that economic development and the future of this country have dramatically and rapidly, and I think permanently, shifted and changed. Now, in the South, and I come from Mississippi, we're all reluctant to change. We move towards things more slowly. Well, we've got to get out of our own way. And the places, I can take you to cities in Montana, in Maine, in New Mexico that get it. And they're making the investments on their own. They're also giving the cover to the elected officials to make decisions of spending public dollars. And like I said, there is no freebie here. The us who are going to spend it are those of us in this room. And ultimately, it comes back to you. You're seeing, if John's correct about the best and brightest leaving, those are your children and grandchildren that are leaving. Is that acceptable to you, that they have to choose somewhere else? I would think not. But you're the ones who can change it. You can raise your voice up so that this man and others like him will be able to make the decisions they know they need to make, but for your support and your funding that ultimately comes with it.
Calvin?
This is going to sound a little pithy, but I think it comes down to marketing and branding. So at Smart Growth America, we kind of have three pillars: technical assistance, which is kind of like consulting, working with cities; thought leadership. John Roberts is a great example of that. And the third pillar is advocacy. And I think part of the challenge here is you have these constituencies with, as John Roberts talked about earlier, kind of a Venn diagram overlap of things that they care about. But right now, there's no sort of broad-based national campaign, and it almost has to start both national, it has to be both national and local at the same time, to inculcate new leadership with the tools they need to convince folks to make the investments that need to be made, to inculcate and convince political leaders to make the investments that have to be made. And unless you play that ground game and that long game, you're never going to get to a point where we can make these decisions happen, because right now the constituencies don't see overlap enough to all end up in the same place where we say 17 cents? No, it should be 25. So I really think it needs to be a political...
That was the real number originally.
25 was the real number?
And it wasn't.
25 was the number to grow. 17 just broke even with
Right.
inflation. So
Right. And so I think the reason why I say ground game and long game is to convince folks that it really needs to be 30 if you want to be tip of the spear and be innovative and do things that aren't currently being done. You have to convince people that the 17 makes sense. And you can't, the challenge is trying to convince people that the 17 makes sense on the day you need the 17. So you needed a campaign, political, legislative, general public, that all leads to that result years before you need to have the conversation about the 17. And so I think we are where we are now, but there needs to be, both from a philanthropic standpoint, a national foundation that's going to fund transportation and transit investments and the advocacy that's needed to convince people to do it. And right now we don't have that. And then there needs to be the corollary locally to do the same.
You know, John, one thing I think that's important is, you know, every community can't be everything for everyone. And when you look at the really smart demographers, they're going to tell you that around this country, you're going to have probably 15 or 20 major cities. You know, the triangle of Austin and Dallas and Houston. And then you're going to have the Atlantas of the world. And then you have another tier of folks that will allow us to spread out. And so the question is, how do you concentrate that? And Baton Rouge is one city that's on that list of not necessarily that top 20 big metropolis of a urbanized area where folks are going to go, but they're right in that mix. And it's important to think that the New Orleans world is going to be in that mix as well, because they are. And so how do you tie those together? One of the challenges we have in Louisiana, quite frankly, is I have two worlds, a very rural world that we have to address and a very urbanized area that we have to address. With that same still 16 cents, that's worth 7, and a penny and a half of it is going to debt service until 2045. That's my reality, is how do I tell folks and that legislator in Bunkie, Louisiana, that this is important for the economy of Bunkie to have a system that attracts mass numbers of people here, and that they can live affordably, that they can move around efficiently, and that the products and the things that they're going to grow in Bunkie has a way to get to the port, that has a way to get out to the rest of the world. And so it's got to be a much bigger discussion in the state, and those communities have to decide what is it they want to be and how they want to address this issue and make some of those investments as well, because we might get the train service from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, but what happens when you get to Baton Rouge? What happens when you get to New Orleans? How do you get from point A to point B? And how does that get you into a neighborhood, in Baker? What happens when you get off that train? It's got to be a continuum of service, and I don't know that that's been touched on in any detail, and I can't tell you that that's going to necessarily change the discussion at the Capitol, but I think those are real issues from a planning and development standpoint that we've got to consider.
So my response is, give me the train and I'll figure that out.
I knew that was coming.
I apologize. I said earlier that we'd give you a chance to ask questions, and I'm sorry that we've just run out of time. A couple of closing thoughts. This has been a very interesting conversation, and I want you to turn a moment to thank our guest speakers. But I want to leave on maybe more of a positive note, is that thanks to the leadership of Secretary Wilson and the governor, they've found unique ways of financing the I-10 to the split, the bridge to the split, and I give you credit for really looking outside the box to finding a vehicle for doing that. I also want to thank the Metro Council and the mayor for looking ahead to $1 billion surface transportation program that is the first that this city's really looked at in decades. That's on the ballot on December the 8th, and I hope you'll give it some thought and perhaps agree with me that we ought to support that. And I also think there's a robust conversation between the parish leaders now to look at that future bridge. And that conversation is started, but I would sum it up to say that this is one of those times where that old saying is true: if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. And I think the takeaway here is that we as citizens have to move from complaining about it and engaging and, in fact, demanding that we find financial resources to get this done. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. Thank you all for being here.